Miyoko Sumida raced down the sidewalk in Amagasaki, Japan, trying to will her body to go faster. Miyoko was 63 years old, and she couldn't remember the last time she had run, and her lungs were on fire and her legs felt heavy. Even though it was a cool day out, she could feel the heavy eyeliner and mascara she always wore starting to run down her face. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to just stop, but she knew that whatever she did, she couldn't stop. She had already waited too long. Miyoko darted across the street and rounded a corner. Ahead of her, the city spread out. In the distance was Amagasaki Castle. It was a white 17th century building with these graceful layers of traditional Japanese curved roofs, and it stood in stark contrast to the rest of the city, which was all low, boxy apartment buildings and factories and warehouses. Miyoko turned a final corner, and there it was, the police station. She ran inside and she called out for help. A police officer came out from behind a window, and in between breaths, Miyoko blurted out the reason she had come. One of her closest friends had gone missing. But the officer just stood there and stared at her calmly and told her to please slow down. And suddenly, Miyoko became aware of what she must look like. A little old frail lady with crazy hair, panting and gasping on the verge of tears. So she tried to steady herself and calm down and start from the beginning. In a shaky voice, Miyoko explained that her next-door neighbor had disappeared. Her neighbor's name was Kai Oe. She was in her 40s, and she was a wonderful, caring friend. But a few days ago, Kai had gotten into a strange car right outside her condominium, and nobody had seen her since. It was like she had vanished into thin air. And so Miyoko worried something terrible had happened to Kai, and now she wished she had come to the police sooner. The officer assured Miyoko that he would file a report and the police would look into this right away. But the officer also said that very likely there was a rational explanation here for why her friend had left. Miyoko began to breathe a bit easier. She told herself everything would be okay. The police would find Kai and bring her home. On November 9th, 2011, a week and a half after Miyoko reported Kai missing, a foreman and his work crew arrived at an old abandoned warehouse in the industrial section of Amagasaki. This warehouse was only a few miles from where Kai had last been seen, but the foreman and his crew didn't know anything about that. They just knew this was where the job they had been hired for was taking place. They were supposed to move some cargo that had been left inside the warehouse to a new location. When the foreman led the crew inside, they saw this vast, mostly empty space with trash and dust on the concrete floor and cobwebs on the walls. There were a few labeled crates scattered around, and so the foreman told his men to start moving them out to the truck. And as the crew took each item out, the foreman would mark it off his list. But then, at some point, one of the workers noticed something tucked away in a dark corner of the warehouse. The worker walked over to it and realized it was this big metal drum, like a barrel that might be used to store oil. At first, he just assumed it was part of the cargo they were supposed to move, so he grabbed it and tried to slide it across the floor. But the drum didn't budge. The worker laughed at himself. He was a pretty strong guy, and he figured he should be able to move a single metal drum on his own, so he took a breath, squatted down, gripped the top of the drum, and tried really hard to pull it out of the corner. But still, it didn't move. A couple of the other workers saw him doing this, and so they joined him in the corner. Together, they all gripped the metal drum and pulled. And it moved, but barely. At this point, the foreman came over to see if he could help, and when he did, he immediately noticed that this drum did not have any markings on it. And he thought that was very strange, because the other items they had come to move had all been very clearly labeled. And so the foreman glanced down at his list, and he did not see the metal drum anywhere on it. This sudden mystery got the crew excited, and they wondered what might be inside of this drum. Maybe there was something valuable or illegal. The foreman thought about just leaving the drum alone, but if it was a valuable item that somehow didn't make it onto this list but was required to be moved, well, the client would be angry if it was left behind. So the foreman told his crew to open the drum to see what was inside. Then they'd figure out what to do with it. The men were all in good spirits and joking with each other as they pulled on the lid, and the foreman could feel his heart beating faster with the anticipation of what they might find inside. Suddenly, the metal lid came loose, and it clanged to the floor. The foreman and his men leaned over the barrel to see what was inside. And for a second, there was absolute silence in the warehouse. As the foreman stared down into the drum, it was like everything around him disappeared. Finally, one of his men let out this awful, strangled scream, and it was like it snapped the foreman back into reality. He fumbled to dig his phone out of his pocket, and then with a shaking hand, he dialed 110, the emergency line for police. Not long after the foreman made that call, the lead investigator on the case, Officer Sato, walked into the warehouse along with dozens of police officers and forensic analysts. The foreman and his crew were still inside, but they had all moved as far away as they could from the drum. Officer Sato nodded at the men, but did not stop to talk to them. Instead, he headed straight for the drum in the corner of the room. And when he reached it and he peered inside, he gave a long, sad sigh. Inside the drum was the twisted body of a dead woman. And there was something else inside of that drum that also horrified Sato. Someone had poured cement inside the drum, and it had hardened and partially encased the woman's lower body. But he could still see enough of the victim to guess that she was probably in her 60s. She had gray hair and wrinkles. Sato could also see that she had bruising on her neck and face, she was completely naked, and she was shockingly thin, almost emaciated. As Sato stared down at the body, he felt his stomach turn. There was a true level of cruelty in the way this victim had been disposed of that hit him hard. But beyond his emotional reaction to this, Sato was also confused, because this scene didn't make sense. It was like his victim didn't match up with his crime scene. If the body of this woman had been found in her home, he could have at least started to wrap his mind around it. Because approximately 1/3 of women who are murdered in Japan are killed by current or former intimate male partners. Most of those murders occur inside the home. But this didn't look anything like a domestic violence killing. In fact, Sato could only think of a few instances that involved covering up and abandoning a body like this, and all of those instances were connected to gang violence. In Japan, these gangs are referred to as yakuza, which is kind of like saying the mafia. Sato knew there were yakuza groups in the city. They typically engaged in financial crimes like extortion, smuggling, and prostitution. But there were occasional episodes of major violence, including murder. Still, yakuza violence typically occurred between different gang factions, not between gang members and normal everyday people. And Sato just couldn't imagine how the victim, this older woman, could have possibly gotten mixed up with the local gang. Sato called over a forensics officer. The forensics officer joined Sato and then stared down into the metal drum. He told Sato the bruising on the woman's face and neck suggested she had been beaten before she was killed, and her body had not decomposed much, which could indicate that she had been killed recently. However, they wouldn't know until the autopsy. Sato nodded and then stepped away from the drum and slowly walked around the warehouse, looking for more evidence. He didn't see any blood on the walls or floors, and there also weren't any rope fibers that would indicate the woman had been bound or held captive in the warehouse. In fact, other than the body, there really was no sign of any violence. But that lack of evidence actually helped Sato begin to form an early theory about what might have happened. He believed the victim was most likely murdered somewhere else, and then placed in the metal drum, and then transported and hidden in this warehouse. A few minutes later, Sato headed back to the police station. He knew he really needed the autopsy before his investigation would have a clear direction, because the autopsy would show him who the victim was. However, in the meantime, he decided that the way the body was disposed of was a decent enough lead to get started. The Yakuza had been known to leave their victims in metal drums, so he would start with them. The following day, members of Sato's investigative team fanned out to the dark corners of Amagasaki. So, back in the 1980s and 90s, and even into the early 2000s, the Yakuza had operated pretty openly in certain bars and restaurants. People could always tell the establishments where the Yakuza were running brothels, because there would be a scantily clad hostess at the door trying to entice customers to come inside, and then when those customers stepped through the door, the whole place would be lit with this strange bright pink light. And if they wanted to spend some money, they could go upstairs and pay for sex. But now, the Japanese police had begun a crackdown on Yakuza activities, passing a series of anti-gang laws and targeting different parts of their operations. And so, when Sato's team talked to people in the seediest bars and restaurants in town, they didn't really come up with anything. It seemed like the Yakuza were just laying low, not murdering women and stuffing their bodies into barrels. Sato began to worry that this Yakuza lead was just going to take his team to a dead end. But then, just a couple of days after the discovery of the body, the autopsy results arrived on Sato's desk. Now, the report couldn't answer when this woman had died. It was impossible to tell if she had been dead for days or months. However, the report did give the identity of the victim. Using dental records, authorities had identified her as Kazuko Oe, a 66-year-old woman who had lived in the city. Sato kept on reading the autopsy, and when he finished it, he found attached at the back was this additional report. And when he read this additional report, he was shocked. The report said the dead woman found in the barrel was the mother of Kai Oe, a woman who'd recently been reported missing. But that was not the craziest thing, because the missing woman, Kai, had not been missing at all. A few days after Kai's neighbor, an older woman named Miyoko Sumida, had filed a missing persons report, the police had tracked down Kai, just 20 minutes away in the major city of Osaka. And it would turn out Kai had been hiding out there using a fake name. Very suspicious. And so Sato quickly contacted the officers who'd found Kai, and they told him that when they'd located her, they had no idea her mother was dead, and so there was no connection drawn about perhaps Kai being involved in the death. And since it was not illegal for her to run away and hide out in a different city and pretend to be somebody else, Kai had simply been brought home and allowed to return to her normal life like nothing had happened. Now, Sato's mind began to race. He wondered if the case was really just this simple. Maybe it had nothing to do with the Yakuza. Maybe Kai had just murdered her own mother and then fled. Sato knew he would have to act fast, because Kai had already tried to escape once, and so he didn't want her to catch wind that he was looking for her, or she might try it again. So Sato quickly flagged down another investigator, and the two of them both ran out to Sato's car and sped through the city. When Officer Sato and the other investigator knocked on the front door of Kai's condominium, a short, nervous-looking man in his 40s greeted them. Now, the man was polite, but it seemed fairly obvious that he did not want them to come inside. The man told Sato that he and his family knew about how Kazuko had been found in the drum in the warehouse, and so they just wanted privacy to deal with their grief. But Sato told the man that he really needed to ask some questions, and they could either talk here, in his home, or the man and his family could come to the police station. The man turned around and scanned the apartment behind him like he was looking for something. Then he muttered something under his breath and turned back to Sato and said, "Okay, you can come inside." Sato and the other investigator paused to remove their shoes, then they followed the man into the front room. And Sato couldn't explain it, but right away he felt like something was off here. He asked the man if he was related to the murder victim, Kazuko, and the man said yes, she was his mother-in-law. But then he quickly corrected himself and said actually she was his former mother-in-law. He was divorced from her daughter, but he still lived in the condo with his ex-wife, their kids, and Kazuko. This surprised Sato. Why would a divorced couple keep living together? But he just smiled and nodded. He wanted to keep the man talking very comfortably. And just because the living situation seemed odd to him, that didn't mean there was anything wrong with it. Eventually, Sato got to the point and asked the man if his ex-wife was Kai Oe, the woman who had gone missing and then returned. The man shook his head. He said he had been married to Kai's younger sister, but Kai actually also lived with them in the condo. The man paused and again looked around the room like he was searching for something, then he turned back to Sato and just began to laugh. Sato glanced at the other investigator, and he looked as creeped out as Sato did. There was something so strange about this man, and it wasn't just that he clearly was very nervous. A lot of people get nervous talking to the police, so they were used to that. This weirdness was something else. Once the man stopped laughing, Sato asked him if Kai was home, and the man turned and pointed to a closed bedroom door. Sato got up and walked over to it, knocked, and announced he was a police officer and asked if he could come inside. There was a brief silence, and then Sato heard light footsteps from inside the room. And slowly, the door opened. And when Sato saw who opened the door, he had to consciously hide his shock, because the woman standing in front of him looked like a corpse. She was rail-thin, and her eyes seemed hollowed out in her face. Sato could see there were stains on her shirt, and her hair was stringy and greasy, like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He asked her if she was Kai, and she just nodded. Sato stepped into the room, while the other investigator stayed back with the man. In the room, Sato saw there was a plate on the floor with scraps of food on it, and also clothes were piled up in different spots. The room smelled sort of musty, like the door hadn't been opened in a long time. Sato wondered when Kai had last left her bedroom. The silence was broken when Kai said she knew why he was there. She had actually been expecting the police ever since she got the news that her mother's body had been found in that warehouse. Sato asked if she knew what had happened to her mother, and in a voice so quiet that Sato had to lean in to hear her, Kai said, "My mother took her own life." This absolutely stunned Sato. If it was a lie, it was a really stupid one. Because why would Kai expect him to believe that her mother had, put herself into a concrete-filled drum? Or was she suggesting that her mother had killed herself, and then Kai, or maybe somebody else in her family, had then disposed of the body by putting it in the drum? Sato waited for Kai to say more, but she didn't. She just went quiet. Finally, when the silence between them had become deafening, Sato asked her, hey, why'd you run off to Osaka a couple of weeks earlier? Kai seemed to force a smile, and then said the whole thing was a big misunderstanding. She had just gone on a quick trip and was surprised anybody even noticed she was gone. Now, this made perhaps less sense than even the idea that Kai's mother had put herself in the drum, but Sato stayed quiet. He didn't want her to know that he was sort of onto her. He was a big believer in letting people trap themselves through their own words. But before Kai could say any more, Sato heard new voices outside the room, and he turned to see 3 people outside in the front room approaching his other investigator. Kai told Sato that the 3 people were her sister and her sister's young teenage daughters. Sato gestured to Kai to come with him, and then the 2 of them stepped out of her bedroom and headed towards the front room. Sato introduced himself to the rest of Kai's family and then shot another look at his partner like, what's going on here? The sister and the children looked as bad as Kai, like they hadn't eaten or slept in days. And when Sato asked them the same basic questions about Kazuko's death that he had asked Kai, he noticed their eyes dart back and forth like they were trying to communicate with each other without actually saying anything. And when they did speak, they all said the same thing, that Kazuko had taken her own life. Sato felt like this whole situation was just insane. He had arrived here thinking maybe Kai was involved in her mother's death, but now, after seeing Kai and her family and the unsettling way they were all living, he had no idea what was going on here. Why were they all so sickly? And why were they telling such transparent lies? Sato didn't know if these people were guilty or innocent, but he did know one thing for sure. They were hiding something. He told the family they would follow up soon, and then he and his partner stepped outside. And then once they were out there, Sato said to his partner that, hey, while we're here, we should speak to the neighbors to see if any of them have a clue about what is going on inside of that condo. They began knocking on doors, but the neighbors would just say they knew nothing and then quickly retreat back inside. Now, this actually was not surprising to Sato. In Japanese culture, people were often reluctant to speak about other families' lives, especially if that family was doing something illegal or if they were mourning the loss of a loved one. But Sato had hoped he would have at least one opportunity for a helpful interview with a neighbor. He had looked at the missing person report that had been filed about Kai, and he knew that the older woman who filed it, Miyoko Sumida, lived right next door. Now, the investigators had actually already knocked on her door, but she hadn't answered. However, Sato figured they should try one more time before they left. After all, she's the one who filed the missing persons report, and so if anybody had more insight on the family, it would be her. And this time, when they knocked on Miyoko's door again, she did answer. However, she just seemed really scared and quickly apologized and said she had nothing more to say. Sato and his partner were about to just give up and leave when a young couple opened up their door and actually invited the investigators inside. The couple told them that months earlier, They had been out walking in a nearby park when all of a sudden they heard a woman screaming. And when they looked in the direction of the scream, they saw Kai, her sister, and her brother-in-law and their daughters beating Kai's mother, Kazuko. They said they had immediately called the police, but when the police arrived, they barely questioned the family. Instead, the officers had a quiet conversation with the family, left after a few minutes, and never followed up with the couple. This didn't surprise Sato either. At this time in Japan, domestic conflicts were handled very differently than pretty much any other kind of criminal investigation. It came down to the same principle of respect for privacy that made Kei's neighbors refuse to talk to them. Basically, police thought that family problems, even nasty ones, should be dealt with by the family. Sato was disappointed he hadn't gotten more information, but as he and his partner left the young couple's home, his mind began to race. Kazuko had been beaten before she died. There was all that bruising on her neck. And now, Sato knew that Kazuko's own family had been beating her. However, this didn't solve the mystery. In fact, it only tangled it further. Because after seeing Kai and the others in that condo, Sato didn't think they could actually physically carry out all the steps of Kazuko's murder. Kai looked so weak that it seemed like she could barely stand on her 2 feet, and the rest of her family wasn't much better. So how could they beat Kazuko to death, then transport her body to the warehouse and cover it with cement? Sato could not answer those questions, and he didn't even know where to look. The next afternoon, Sato was at his desk trying to figure out his next step when his phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the other end spoke barely above a whisper, and he said, "I have important information about Kazuko Oe's murder." Sato felt a rush of adrenaline, and instinctively he just stood up at his desk. He asked who the caller was, but the man wouldn't give a name, and Sato didn't want to scare him off, so he didn't press. The man said he didn't know how Kazuko had died, but he was certain that her family was under the thumb of a vicious Yakuza gang. And this particular gang had a ruthless leader, who was perhaps the most terrifying Yakuza leader in the whole city. After that, the caller hung up. Sato stood there in shock. It was like he had arrived back at the very beginning of this case, when he had stood over Kazuko's body in the metal drum and wondered if this was the work of the Yakuza. Sato immediately began a deep dive into the Oe family's finances. He knew that almost all Yakuza crime just came down to money. And right away, a series of financial transactions jumped out at him. Over the past 2 years, the family had made repeated big payments at regular intervals. And when investigators tracked the group receiving these payments, they discovered a connection to the Yakuza. So, Sato began to believe that Kazuko's family had somehow gotten into debt with the wrong people, and Kazuko had paid with her life. And on November 26, 2011, which was just over 2 weeks after the discovery of the body, Sato rounded up 5 known Yakuza members in the area and brought them in for questioning. However, Yakuza members rarely ever talked to the police, so after 5 mostly silent interviews, Sato had no clear evidence linking any of them to the murder. And he still had no idea who this gang's supposed ruthless leader was. So by the time that 2011 ended, Sato had hit another dead end. And soon months went by with no new evidence coming in. And so Sato began to think that he might never know who killed Kazuko. On October 14, 2012, so 11 months after the discovery of Kazuko's body, a pair of Amagasaki police officers approached an empty one-story house in a residential neighborhood. They were following up on an anonymous tip, very similar to the one that Sato had gotten. From the outside, the house looked like every other house on the block. But the second the officers opened the door, they knew something was very wrong with this place. The faint odor of something rotten filled the front room. The power was out, so the officers turned on their flashlights and headed down a dark hallway. The further they went into the house, the worse the smell got. Towards the back of the house, the officers found a room that was closed off by traditional Japanese sliding doors with wood frames covered in opaque paper. As they approached it, the rotten smell became almost unbearable. They braced themselves and then opened the sliding doors. Inside, they saw 6 large tatami mats made of thick woven straw covering the floor. Traditionally, shoes and socks would be removed before stepping on these mats, but the officers just quickly walked into the room, because they were sure that whatever they were looking for was somewhere inside of here. The rotten smell seemed to be coming from somewhere below them, so one of the officers crouched down, held his breath, grabbed the edge of the mat in the center of the room, and started to pull. And as the mat slid away, darkness opened up beneath it, and the officer shouted to his partner to come look. Under the mat, there was a hole in the floor, and when the officers peered down inside of it, what they saw made them want to run out of the room and vomit, because at the bottom of that hole, partially encased in cement, were 3 naked, decomposing bodies. These officers quickly alerted Officer Sato, and it didn't take long for Sato to discover that these 3 new victims shared a common link with his original victim, Kazuko Oe. This link was a person who they were all very close to. It would turn out all 4 of these victims had been the victims of the Yakuza. There was a ruthless Yakuza leader who had overseen all of their murders. But Sato would soon learn that these murders were just the tip of the iceberg. This particular gang leader had overseen the murder of multiple entire families over the last 25 years. Based on evidence discovered at several crime scenes and from interviews conducted over the course of a year, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kazuko Oe. On the night of September 11th, 2011, 2 months before Kazuko's body would be found, the ruthless Yakuza leader reclined on a luxurious couch in a room filled with high-end furniture and artwork. The leader checked the time and then picked up a phone and made a call. One of the killers answered, and without hesitating, the leader told the killer, "Now." Then the leader hung up, tossed the phone on the couch, and calmly waited. Not long after that, the 2 killers stood outside of Kazuko's bedroom, where she was fast asleep. After a minute, they signaled to each other that they were ready. Then they opened the door and rushed Kazuko's bed and leapt on top of her. Kazuko woke up to the sight of fists flying at her face. She tried to fight off the killers, but they had her pinned down, and each punch left her dazed and writhing in pain. She tried to cry out, but she was too weak. The killers brushed away Kazuko's arms as she tried desperately to protect herself, and they kept on pounding her in the face, the neck, and the head, until Kazuko just stopped fighting back. When Kazuko went still, and the killers realized she was dead, they climbed off the bed and backed out of the room. Back in the front room, one of the killers called the leader to say the job was done. But the leader just laughed and told the killers to stay right there, because the job was not, in fact, done. The killers did exactly what they were told. They always did exactly what they were told. They stood there in complete silence, waiting. Finally, the front door opened, and the ruthless Yakuza leader walked into the condominium. The killers led the leader into Kazuko's bedroom. The leader stared at Kazuko's body, and then barked for the killers to move her to the bathtub and cover her with ice. The killers obeyed. And once Kazuko's body lay under a blanket of ice, the leader brought the killers back to the front room. There, the leader told them to write a suicide note, and to make sure the note included Kazuko's last wishes, that Kazuko wanted to leave all of her money, her possessions, and property to the Yakuza leader. The leader then told the killers that the last thing they would have to do was secure a metal drum, so that other members of the gang could transport the drum with Kazuko's body inside to a warehouse. The killers nodded silently. Once the plan was set, the leader smiled at the killers and then turned around and walked back outside, and went right back next door to the condominium where they lived and went back to relaxing on the couch. The ruthless Yakuza leader who had ordered the brutal murder of Kazuko Oe and who had presided for more than 2 decades over a secret and twisted reign of terror, was literally the last person Sato or anyone else had expected when this investigation began. Because the leader didn't look like some hardened criminal who could rule people through physical intimidation. Instead, she looked like a kind old woman. Her name was Miyoko Sumida. She was the 63-year-old woman who had rushed to the police to tell them that her neighbor, Kai Oe, had gone missing and she was so upset about it. But to just call Miyoko a Yakuza leader would be a huge understatement. Miyoko was more like a serial killer and a cult leader. Over the course of their investigation, Sato and his team discovered that Miyoko's introduction to cruelty and brutality had come at a very young age. She grew up in Amagasaki during the chaos of post-World War II Japan, when the country was trying to recover from the devastation of the war. During that time, certain areas of the country bordered on lawlessness, and Miyoko's father had taken full advantage of that. Miyoko's father had been a very successful contractor who brought in North Korean laborers to work for him. He let those workers live in his home and eat his food, but he also beat those workers every day, took 40% of their wages, and threatened to kill them if they didn't do exactly as he asked. And so over time, out of fear and desperation, these men became completely obedient to Miyoko's father. And Miyoko had watched all of this very closely and even had begun to study her father's methods. Then, in her 20s, Miyoko herself entered into a life of crime, using a lot of what she had learned from her father. Her first major foray into the criminal world had been to buy one of those bars with the bright pink lights on the seedy side of the city that offered customers the opportunity to pay for sex. That had allowed Miyoko to meet members of the local Yakuzas and to familiarize herself with their tactics. When she was ready, she sold the bar and assembled a gang of her own. She recruited family, friends, and other people she trusted. Miyoko set out to get as much money and power as she possibly could, and using threats of violence from her gang played a role in her plans. But Miyoko went far beyond typical Yakuza violence to get what she wanted. Because just like her father, Miyoko understood that fear alone was not enough to own people. Her victims, they had to need her. In a way, Miyoko made her victims love her. To do this, she targeted families that owned property or businesses. She infiltrated those families by offering things like financial assistance to help their businesses grow. And at first, people viewed her as a generous benefactor, a kind, wealthy woman who just wanted to help others succeed. But once Miyoko gained a family's trust, she used what some might call mind control to gain power over them. She would start by turning members of the family against each other, causing problems in their house or in their business, and then blaming those problems on one specific family member. And through her financial assistance, Miyoko would start to make that family feel dependent on her to survive, just like her father had done with the laborers. And Miyoko would also use her money as a way to get family members to do favors for her. These favors started out small and got bigger over time. And slowly, the family would grow more and more obedient. And while all this was happening, Miyoko would start to make rules about when a family could eat, when they could sleep, who they could talk to, and when they could go outside. And if any of them pushed back, Miyoko would order her gang to inflict serious physical harm on them. So using these methods, Miyoko was able to completely break people down mentally and physically to the point where entire families were terrified of her and also simultaneously completely loyal to her. And it would turn out Miyoko had used these methods to infiltrate Kazuko's family. That's how she got Kazuko's own daughter, Kai, and other family members to publicly beat Kazuko, like that young couple had witnessed in the park. But Miyoko's demands did not stop with forced beatings. Her ultimate goal was to take everything that family had. Their money, their property, their assets, all of it. And for that to happen, Kazuko would have to die, and then give everything to Miyoko in her will. But Miyoko did not want blood on her own hands. This was the horrifying truth that Sato and his investigators discovered at the heart of this case. Miyoko and the members of her gang did not physically murder Kazuko. Instead, at Miyoko's command, Kai and her sister beat their own mother to death. in manipulating Kazuko's daughters into murdering her and then willing over all her assets, Miyoko had imposed her brutal will, like she had done without consequence for years. But what she hadn't counted on this time was Kai's reaction. Because Miyoko may have thought that she had Kai completely under her control, like she had everyone else, but she was wrong. A tiny part of who Kai was before Miyoko came into her life had survived. After Kai had murdered her own mother, she felt instant regret, and she couldn't contain it. Now, Miyoko had noticed Kai's emotional turmoil, and she knew it posed a risk to her. So, on October 30th, 2011, Miyoko had left Kai tied up and locked in a car alone, debating what she should do with her. But Kai had managed to escape, and that's when she fled to Osaka and began living under a different name. When Miyoko realized that Kai was gone, she ran to the police station and played the hysterical, desperate old woman just trying to find someone she loved. She knew the police would immediately believe her, and she was right. And when the police found Kai, she refused to tell them anything. Remember, she was terrified of Miyoko, but she was also guilty of her own mother's murder. How could she possibly explain her situation to the police? So she just came home. And so by the time Sato visited the OF family condo, Kai had been locked inside of her bedroom, starved, and was getting beaten by her own family ever since her return. And Kai almost certainly would have suffered the same fate as her mother if that work crew in the old abandoned warehouse hadn't gotten curious about the unmarked drum mixed in with the rest of their cargo. It would turn out that over the course of 25 years, Miyoko had infiltrated and destroyed at least 5 families, including the family that was found under the floor. And each time, Miyoko had manipulated members of those families to kill each other or to kill themselves. In the end, police charged Miyoko with 8 murders, but they were only able to recover 6 bodies. And there are a lot of people who believe that Miyoko has been involved in even more murders. Kai and her sister were ultimately treated as victims in Miyoko's crimes, and they were not charged in their mother's murder. In December of 2012, while in prison, Miyoko strangled herself with her own clothes and died in her cell. After her death, Miyoko would come to be known in Japan by names like the Killer Grandma, Piranha, and the Demon. But to this day, some people refuse to believe that Miyoko is actually dead. They argue that she simply used her powers of manipulation to fake her own death and escape from prison. In 1993, David Lewis was an accomplished lawyer living in Amarillo, Texas, with his wife Karen and his 9-year-old daughter. He was known to be a devoted husband and father who spent much of his off time supporting various charitable causes. On January 28th of that year, Karen and their daughter decided to leave Amarillo and go to Dallas to spend the weekend shopping together. David, who would normally go with them, decided to stay home because he did not want to miss the Super Bowl, which was that Sunday, the 31st. So Karen and their daughter left, and then a couple of days later, on the 31st, they returned to Amarillo, and they actually got back to their house right after the Super Bowl had ended. And so they anticipated going into the house and finding David either cleaning up after himself or maybe watching the post-game. But when they walked in, the TV was still on and turned to the channel the Super Bowl had been on, but David was nowhere to be found. Karen noticed that the VCR was actually still recording. David was known to record all major sports games and watch them again, and so clearly he had not turned off the recording. As Karen walked around the house yelling for her husband, she wasn't that concerned. She figured he must have stepped out or something, but she went into the kitchen and she opened up the fridge and she found there was a plate with 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches on it, which was a sandwich David would often make. And she thought that was pretty weird that he would have made them and then let them sit inside the fridge. And so she closed the fridge and turned around, and on the counter in the kitchen was his wedding band and his watch. And so even though there were all these kind of strange things that Karen was finding in the house, she really wasn't that concerned. There was no sign of forced entry, there was no sign the house had been burglarized, there was no sign of a struggle, and so she assumed her husband must have stepped out to watch the second half of the game at a friend's house and that he would be back later. And so Karen stayed up for a little while, but then ultimately she went to bed thinking he would be there in the morning. But the next morning when she got up, there was no sign of her husband, and so she went to the police. Within 24 hours, the police located David's abandoned car downtown near the courthouse. Under one of the car's floor mats, they located his car keys as well as his house keys. And then within the car, they found his checkbook, his credit cards, and his driver's license, all in the places they should be. They looked into his bank activity and they saw there was a recent deposit for $5,000 into his family's account. They also saw that he recently purchased 2 plane tickets. One was from Los Angeles to Dallas, and the other was from Dallas to Amarillo, but it wasn't clear if he had used either of these tickets. When Karen was told about the found car and the strange bank activity, she told police that her husband had recently told her that he actually thought he might be in danger, because he was scheduled to give a deposition in Dallas later that month in a conflict of interest case between his old law firm and a wealthy client. And David was being pressured to cover up some of the wrongdoings of his previous law firm, and he just wasn't willing to do that. He told his family that he was going to tell the truth no matter who it hurt. David understood that put a huge target on his back. While police were certainly intrigued at this new information, they didn't have any evidence to support the idea that someone was actively trying to silence David. It was just a conspiracy. And so for 11 months, they looked for new leads and new information, but nothing came out and David never popped up. He never called home. There was no sign of him. And so after 11 months, the police decided that David must have left of his own accord and that there was no foul play here, and so they closed the case. And after that, David's family unfortunately just had to accept the fact that he was gone and that more than likely no one was ever going to find him again. But in 2004, a state trooper in Washington state was on the internet just researching unsolved mysteries, and he came across a picture of David Lewis. And immediately he recognized that he looked exactly like an unidentified victim of a hit-and-run case he covered back in 1993. And so he pulled up the details of this hit and run, and he found the victim had been struck a day after David Lewis had gone missing. When this John Doe got hit, he was dressed head to toe in military clothing, he had no bags, he had no ID, and he was walking aimlessly down Highway 24 in Washington state, so 1,600 miles away from Amarillo, Texas, where David Lewis had gone missing. But despite the enormous distance between these two events, this trooper was convinced David Lewis was this John Doe. But as he's looking at the picture of David Lewis, he realizes he has glasses and he didn't think the John Doe was wearing glasses. But just to be sure, he checked the belongings list of the John Doe and it said he did have glasses. And it was the exact same kind that David was wearing in the picture. And eventually, DNA would confirm that David Lewis was the John Doe. Now, this solved the mystery of where David Lewis went, but it did not solve the mystery of why he went there. Why did David go to Washington, a place where he has no ties? And if David was the one who hit record on his VCR on the night of the Super Bowl, that means he would have only had less than 24 hours to move 1,600 miles to Washington state without his car. And why was he wearing military clothing? Was that his clothing? Did he buy it? Did someone make him wear it? Where was his luggage? What was he doing walking down the highway? David's assertions to his wife that his life was in danger, his demeanor as a loving family man, and the nature of his job as an attorney has many people, his family included, believing that he was the victim of foul play. But officially, the police have said David left the house of his own accord and his death was ruled an accident.
Our next story is called Single Blow.
In 1996, Blair Adams was 31 years old and living in Surrey, British Columbia. Although in the past he had struggled with substance abuse and alcoholism, over the previous 2 years he had really gotten his act together and got a great job as a foreman at a local construction company. He was known to be a cheerful and friendly guy that did not have any known enemies. But that summer, Blair started exhibiting uncharacteristic mood swings that his mother would describe as being frequent and wild. In a matter of weeks, Blair transformed from being very calm and relaxed and friendly to being totally panicked all the time and always looking over his shoulder, and he was so stressed out he couldn't sleep at night. And he began telling his coworkers that he was fairly certain someone was trying to kill him. And they would say to him, "Blair, I don't think you're okay. You really need to see a doctor." When his mother confronted him about his erratic, paranoid behavior, He told her, "Mom, I really shouldn't tell you about it." And she said, "What's it?" And he said, "Mom, I can't say anything else." And that was it. She could never get any more information out of her son. Blair's strange behavior came to a head on Friday, July 5th, when he went to his bank and withdrew all of the cash out of his account, totaling $6,000, and he also emptied his safety deposit box, which contained thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold. 2 days later, on Sunday, he left his house and drove 30 minutes to the Canada-USA border, and he attempted to enter the United States. But being a single guy carrying a bunch of cash and jewelry and acting really nervous, he fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and so he was denied entry. Frustrated, Blair left and went back to his house, and the next day, which was Monday, he went to his construction site and he abruptly told his boss that he was quitting. And he didn't even pick up his final paycheck, he just left. After leaving the construction site, he went straight to the airport where he promptly purchased a $1,600 round trip to Frankfurt, Germany. Although we don't know why he wanted to go to Frankfurt, Germany, he did work there briefly the year before. His flight was supposed to leave the following day, which was Tuesday, but immediately after purchasing this plane ticket, Blair suddenly decided that he needed to try again to cross into the USA. So he rushed to a friend's house, he knocked on her door, she opens it up and he looks totally disheveled, and he's telling her that someone's trying to kill me, I need your help getting across the border, I just got rejected a couple of days ago, can you please drive me across, you got kids, it'll look much more convincing, can you do that for me? And she was really spooked by his behavior and felt like this is not something I want to get involved with, and so she said, "Sorry, I can't help you." So Blair headed home where he hid out for the day, and then the next day, Tuesday, he went to the airport, but instead of getting on his flight to Frankfurt, Germany, he went to the front desk and requested a refund, and it was granted. He told them that the person he was going to meet in Germany had gotten sick, and so now he couldn't go. And so the only person he could have been talking about was the girl he had briefly had a fling with when he was there for work the year earlier. But later on, investigators would talk to that German girl, and she would say she was not in touch with Blair and she definitely was not expecting him. Blair left the airport and rented a car, which was a Nissan Altima, and he immediately went to the US-Canada border, except this time he was able to get across. He made his way to Seattle, Washington, where he went over to their airport and then abandoned his Nissan in the middle of a parking lot and then went down and bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. Now, he paid $770 for this one-way ticket, but he could have just purchased a round trip for half the price. But either way, he boarded the plane that night, and by Wednesday morning, he was in Washington, D.C. He got off the plane and rented another car, which was a Toyota Camry, and then drove 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. Blair was not seen in Knoxville until about 5:30 p.m. that evening when he showed up at a gas station complaining of car troubles. And so the gas station attendant came out to try to help Blair, and he immediately diagnosed what the problem was. Blair was trying to start his Toyota Camry with the key to his Nissan Altima that he had abandoned in Seattle, Washington. And so the attendant pointed out that it was the wrong key, and Blair held it up and said, "No, this is the one I was using." And the guy's like, "No, it clearly says Nissan on it." And so Blair and this gas station attendant look around the car inside and out for this missing Toyota key. Blair's reaching in his pockets, he can't find it. Blair ends up calling the rental company, but they wind up being closed. And so the gas station attendant says, "Unfortunately, we're going to have to tow your car, but I'll give you a ride to a nearby hotel." And so Blair accepted the ride, and just after 6 p.m. that night, Blair walked through the front door of the Fairfield Inn, and then promptly turned around and walked out, and then walked in, and then walked out. Over and over again, 5 separate times over the course of an hour before he finally walked up to the front desk and asked for a room. The front desk attendant at the hotel said Blair was totally paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, and just totally on edge the entire time. And then after she gave him his room and he paid for it, he took the key, and instead of going up to his room, he just walked out again and then never came back. The following morning, 2 workers arrived at their construction site right across the street from the Fairfield Inn, and they discovered a body, and it would turn out to be Blair's. He was missing his socks, shoes, and pants, and he had scratches on his hands as well as on his face, but none of the abrasions were that significant. There was $4,000 in German, US, and Canadian currencies lying on the ground around him. Also spread out around Blair was his fanny pack full of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold, a black duffel bag that contained maps and receipts, and then also that missing Toyota car key that they could not find the night before. That was lying on the ground as well. Blair's autopsy showed that he had died from a single violent blow to his stomach, but they had no idea what actually struck his stomach. Toxicology reports showed that Blair had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The only DNA evidence that was found at the crime scene was a single long strand of hair that Blair was clutching in his fist. But there's no more information about this hair online. There were no witnesses, but there was a security guard who claimed to have heard screaming, a woman's scream, coming from the area where Blair was discovered at about 3:30 in the morning. The only lead police had was the sketch of this guy that apparently people had seen Blair talking to outside of a Cracker Barrel restaurant right after Blair had left the hotel. But police were never able to identify this man. Investigators were baffled. Was Blair telling the truth that someone had been trying to kill him for weeks leading up to his death and they finally caught up to him? And if so, why didn't he tell authorities? Or was Blair delusional and he just happened to run into another killer when he was in Tennessee? Unfortunately, we still have absolutely no idea.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Riddle Me This.
At around 5 o'clock in the evening on June 25th, 1999, a man named Ricky McCormick stumbled into an emergency room in St. Louis, Missouri, with his hand over his chest, complaining that he couldn't breathe. He said he had asthma, and earlier that day he had been cutting the grass, and so maybe that had caused a flare-up. But either way, here he was in a lot of discomfort saying, I need help. Ricky was 41 years old, and for his whole life, he had had heart and lung problems, and so him arriving in this state in the ER was actually not all that uncommon for him. And so this hospital did what they did with anyone who came in complaining that they couldn't breathe. They immediately took Ricky to a back exam room, and they hooked him up to all these monitors to make sure his heartbeat was steady and that his oxygen levels were plenty high. And once Ricky was in the exam room getting hooked up, he started acting really agitated, and he kept looking around the room like he was scared that someone was going to jump out at him. And he was also sweating profusely, and whenever he did speak, he spoke so quickly no one could really understand him. But despite Ricky's odd behavior, the heart monitor showed his heart was beating steadily, his oxygen levels were perfectly fine, and when the doctor came in and examined Ricky, even though he clearly saw that something was off about Ricky, there wasn't any sign that there was anything physically wrong with Ricky. And so the doctor and the nurses agreed that whatever was going on with Ricky had to be psychological. And as it happened, Ricky did have a long history of psychological issues. He was known for making things up all the time, just telling people these crazy stories about himself, like how he was this talented singer and he was about to go on tour, or that he was actually a prince, or that he was studying to be a doctor. I mean, things that nobody thought was true, but Ricky would say as if this is just common knowledge. This is who I am. And so Ricky's family for the longest time had just assumed that Ricky was either bipolar or maybe schizophrenic. Those are both serious mental health disorders that totally disrupt normal thinking. But Ricky, despite being encouraged by his friends and family to go get help, never got help for any of his psychological issues. And so Ricky's life had kind of gone off the rails. He had dropped out of high school and not gone back to any sort of schooling, and he had spent some time in jail. Now, Ricky was living in a low-income, very dangerous part of St. Louis, which is a big Midwestern city on the Mississippi River, that in 1999 had a very serious issue with gang violence. Ricky absolutely hated it there, but he had no way to actually leave St. Louis. In fact, Ricky didn't even have his own place. He bounced around from his mother's place, his aunt's place, and his girlfriend's place. Ricky did work, but the work was very sporadic, and it was for the most part just night shifts for random odd jobs. And when Ricky was actually working, he really just spent his time chain smoking cigarettes and drinking literally gallons of coffee. Back at the ER, Ricky, who was still in the exam room, had only been there for less than an hour
when the doctor came back in and told Ricky that he was okay and he was going to be discharged. Now, Ricky immediately said, no, I have to be here tonight. I need to stay here. You need to admit me. But the doctor just kind of ignored what he said and handed him the discharge paperwork. 15 minutes later, when a nurse came back into the exam room to get this paperwork from Ricky, she would walk in and see Ricky still sitting on the exam bed, kind of fidgeting around, looking down at this paperwork on his lap that immediately she saw he had not filled out. He had just signed his name at the bottom. And when she walked in, Ricky looked up at her and he kind of shrugged his shoulders and looked at her and was like, I don't know how to read or write. Can you help me? And so the nurse immediately felt bad for Ricky. I mean, he's got dirty clothes on. He looks thin and frail. He's clearly very down on his luck. There's some issues happening with this guy, and he can't even fill out his discharge paperwork. And so she said, no problem. She sat down with him, and together they filled out his paperwork. And then afterwards, when she walked him out of the exam room back to the front of the hospital, Ricky turned to her and said, instead of going home, can you just let me stay here in the lobby just for tonight? And this nurse, who knew she was not allowed to do this, she looked around and saw it was not a busy night there. And so she said, okay, as long as you don't bother anyone, you can stay here. And so Ricky thanked her repeatedly and then walked over to the corner, kind of far away from the front desk and far away from the front door. And he sat down and folded his arms, and then he just stared at the front door. And so this nurse assumed that Ricky actually must be homeless, especially based on, how he came in and how he was acting. And so she figured, he needs a place that's warm to stay tonight. And so the nurse went back to her station, and over the course of the next several hours, she would periodically look out into the lobby, expecting to see Ricky kind of curled up asleep in the corner. But every time she looked out there, Ricky was still sitting upright, arms folded, staring at the front door of the hospital, as if he was expecting someone to come in at any moment, and he needed to be ready. And so she thought this was unusual, but she decided not to intervene. She just let him sit there and do his thing. Later that morning, at 11:30 a.m., when the nice nurse who had allowed Ricky to stay in the lobby was leaving her shift, another crew of nurses came in, and right away they noticed Ricky was just sitting in the corner for no apparent reason. And when they walked up to him to ask if he was okay, what are you doing here? What can we do for you? Ricky, instead of trying to talk to any of these nurses, just got up and walked out of the hospital. After leaving the hospital, Ricky walked to a nearby payphone and he called his girlfriend, Sandy. And when Sandy picked up the phone, she immediately recognized her boyfriend's very familiar voice, but she also picked up that he sounded really tired and kind of out of it. And so when she asked him, are you okay? What's going on? Ricky would tell her that he had just spent the night in the hospital. But he didn't clarify that he had spent the night in the lobby of the hospital, not admitted as a patient at the hospital. But to Sandy, it really didn't matter because already this was raising red flags for her, because this was actually the second time that Ricky had gone to the ER just that week. Just a few days earlier, Ricky had been released from a different hospital in St. Louis after telling doctors there that he had had these chest pains and he couldn't breathe. And so he had been admitted for a couple of days, but ultimately they determined that there really was nothing wrong with him. And they too believed whatever was happening with him had to be psychological. And so he had been released. Additionally, Sandy had been growing increasingly worried about Ricky because over the last several weeks, Ricky had begun acting really paranoid to the point where anytime he was in her apartment and somebody outside the apartment just walked down the hallway, Ricky would jump as if he was worried whoever was out there was going to barge in at any moment. But whenever Sandy asked Ricky, what's going on? Why are you so paranoid? He refused to elaborate. So, feeling very concerned about Ricky, on this phone call, Sandy would say to Ricky, please come to my apartment and let me take care of you. If you're not feeling well, I'll make you feel better. Just please come to my apartment right now. But Ricky said no, he did not want to go to Sandy's apartment. He told her instead he was going to walk to a nearby gas station to get a bite to eat, and then afterwards he would give Sandy a call. And so the two of them agreed to this plan. They hung up. But then Ricky did not call Sandy later. A worker at the gas station where Ricky said he was going would later tell authorities that Ricky did come into the gas station and he got a hot dog on that day, the 26th. And then the next day, this same worker said, yep, we saw Ricky again on the 27th. He came in here, he got a bite to eat, and then he left. But after that, nobody saw Ricky. Not his aunt, not his mom, not his girlfriend. He didn't show up in any other emergency rooms in Missouri. He just disappeared. On June 30th, so 3 days after Ricky was last seen at this gas station, a woman was driving her car 20 miles north of St. Louis on this highway when she looked out into this cornfield that butted up against the highway, and she saw kind of in the middle of it was this dark shape that looked totally out of place. And so she was intrigued enough that she actually pulled over on the road, she got out, and began walking into this cornfield to see what this thing was. And when she got up to this thing and saw what it was, she froze in horror, and then she screamed, turned around, and ran back to her car, and she flew to the nearest gas station. She grabbed a payphone, and she called 911. When the police arrived at this cornfield, they too walked out towards this dark thing, and then finally they saw what this thing was that had scared this woman. It was a dead person who was lying face down. Their body was very badly decomposed, and in fact, their body was just kind of falling apart, like the fingers of this person's body had just kind of crumpled off of their hands. Now, based on what this person was wearing, they appeared to be male, but there was no way to tell how this person died or really how long they had been dead for. But despite the advanced decomposition, authorities were able to get a good fingerprint, and it would turn out that this body belonged to Ricky McCormick. The day after Ricky's body was found, the police would come out and say they were treating his death as a homicide. This area along this highway in this cornfield was actually a fairly common place for murderers to dump their victims. And it was very unlikely that Ricky had gotten there by himself. He didn't have a car. In fact, he didn't even have a driver's license. There was no public transportation that could have brought him to this spot. And if Ricky had decided to walk to this area for some reason, it was a solid 15 miles from where he lived and worked. Also, Ricky's body was way too decomposed relative to when he had last been seen alive, just 3 days earlier. And so there was a theory that perhaps he was killed somewhere else and then kept indoors in heat, and that had accelerated his decomposition, and that at some point whoever had killed him had moved his body and dumped it in this cornfield. And so on that first day of the homicide investigation, July 1st, the police put 18 detectives, so a ton of detectives, on this case, and they also appealed to the public to come forward if you had any information about what could have happened to Ricky McCormick. But just a day later, on July 2nd, the police came out and made an announcement that, after looking at all the evidence and looking at Ricky's body again, it did not appear, in fact, that he had been murdered, but instead he must have died of natural causes. This is a guy that had lung and heart problems, and so that is likely what killed him. Case closed. And so after this announcement, all of the evidence in Ricky's case was bundled up, put into storage, and people just kind of forgot about it. 6 months later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, got a tip that involved Ricky McCormick. They were working on a case in St. Louis, Missouri about this major drug dealer who apparently was ordering hits on his rivals, and a confidential informant came forward and told the FBI that this guy, Ricky McCormick, had gotten wrapped up with this major drug dealer. But they didn't really know what role Ricky was playing with this drug dealer. It was just kind of a rumor on the street that, Ricky was involved somehow. This did not make any sense to the FBI because they're thinking, why would this big-time drug dealer who really was a mover and shaker in St. Louis get involved with this guy, Ricky McCormick, who was obviously deeply mentally ill and borderline homeless? I mean, what role could Ricky play for this drug dealer? But the FBI still did follow up on this tip because it was very credible, and when they spoke to the local police who had investigated Ricky's death, they got Ricky's file, which meant they got all of the evidence, and immediately the FBI realized the local police had overlooked a very strange piece of evidence found in Ricky's pocket. This strange evidence was quickly sent to FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, and it landed on the desk of a forensic analyst named Dan Olson. Dan was relatively new to the FBI, but he was highly disciplined and very methodical. And so when he received this piece of evidence, he got to work right away trying to figure out what it was, what it meant in relationship to Ricky and this drug dealer. Maybe does it answer the question of how these people are connected? But despite his best efforts in calling in the experts and using every computer program to analyze this evidence, he just could not figure out what it meant. At the same time that Dan was doing this, the big drug dealer who was the target of that big FBI investigation in St. Louis was arrested on gun and drug charges, and so the big case was now over. And suddenly, trying to figure out what connection Ricky McCormick had to this drug dealer was kind of irrelevant because the drug dealer was behind bars and Ricky was already dead. And so the FBI kind of put a pause on trying to figure out what this evidence was. And so Dan, even though he was really curious now, he was fully invested in trying to figure out what this thing was, he realized he had to give it up too and move on to something else. And so the strange evidence went back into storage, and once again, everyone just kind of moved on from Ricky McCormick. But Dan never really forgot about this mystifying piece of evidence. It was always in the back of his mind. 22 years later, Dan Olson had now become very senior at the FBI. He was actually in charge of their cryptanalysis and racketeering unit. Basically, he was in charge of the people at the FBI who specialized in code breaking, meaning they were the people that would pull any sort of secret messages embedded inside of evidence. And so at some point after taking over this unit, Dan pulled out of storage this strange piece of evidence connected to Ricky McCormick, and he said, you know what? I just need to know what this means. I have to figure it out. I've never been able to. It's haunted me ever since. And so Dan went public. He went to the media and he asked the world to take a look at this mystifying piece of evidence and come forward if you have any idea what it means. When Ricky was discovered in that cornfield, the local police quickly emptied his pockets. And in his pants pocket were 2 documents that contained an incredibly complex cipher or code. It was basically 30 lines on each piece of paper with different symbols and letters and capital letters. I mean, it looked like total gibberish to the untrained eye. But to people like Dan and his code-breaking team, these symbols and letters could mean there was a secret message hidden inside of these documents if you could break the code system. But of course, no one could ever break that code. So how in the world does a guy like Ricky, who is basically functionally illiterate and can only write his name, he's clearly mentally ill and he's not really in touch with reality all the time, how does a guy like that come to be in possession of these complex ciphers? And if he didn't write these ciphers, because that's possible, maybe somebody else gave them to Ricky, well, why would anyone who came up with this very complex cipher entrust a guy like Ricky to be the one to carry these things around? I mean, presumably, they contain confidential information that's been very carefully hidden inside of the cipher. And so why give it to Ricky? He's such a liability. And also, what happened to Ricky in that cornfield? I mean, we don't even know how he got there. We don't know how he was killed. All we know is that he had these ciphers in his pocket when he was found. And so many people believe, including law enforcement, that the answer to, what happened to Ricky and what was his connection to this drug lord in St. Louis, if any, or, what was he up to, will all be solved if we can just figure out what these 2 ciphers mean. But as of right now, no one has solved the riddle of what these 2 ciphers mean. All we know is that Ricky McCormick, a couple of weeks before he died, became increasingly paranoid and was so scared of someone or something that he was likely running into these hospitals just to hide out. But eventually, whoever or whatever Ricky was scared of very likely caught up to him and killed him. But until we crack these ciphers, we very likely will have no idea what actually happened to Ricky McCormick. Today, the FBI has set up a special website where you can look at these two ciphers that Ricky had in his pocket, and if you're able to crack them, because someone's going to eventually, you can tell the FBI through this website and potentially help solve Ricky's murder.
On August 8th, 1998, Sharon Anderson's eyes shot open to the sound of her 8-year-old son's wailing. She glanced over at the bedside clock and saw it was only 4 a.m. Toby, her son, was a very deep sleeper, so she knew it had to be something serious to wake him up at this hour. So Sharon jumped out of bed and rushed down the hall to his room. Toby was still in his bed, and he was holding his belly with both hands. He was covered by a film of sweat, and he was moaning in pain. Sharon laid the back of her hand on Toby's forehead, and she found that he was burning hot. In fact, he felt much hotter than when he normally got sick. Sharon knew her son needed medical attention right now. She rushed back to her bedroom, woke up her husband, and told him to go get the car ready so they could drive their son to the emergency room. Then she ran back to Toby's room, she scooped him up in a blanket, and carried him down the hall. It was still dark out as Sharon and her husband loaded Toby into their car. Fortunately, the streets of Minneapolis were empty at that hour as they raced to the nearest hospital. Attending physician Dr. Jean Miller was just starting her shift when her office intercom buzzed and a voice announced that an 8-year-old boy named Toby had just been wheeled into the ER. His mother, Sharon, said Toby had been feverish for hours and was throwing up. Dr. Miller jumped up from her desk and dashed down the hall to the emergency room. She found Toby lying in bed, his eyes half open and his skin drained of color, while his pajamas were dark with sweat. The boy's parents hovered beside the bed looking worried and helpless. Dr. Miller called for a nurse to bring an IV saline drip to get some fluids into the boy. Then she measured his heartbeat and listened to his breathing. But the child's intense stomach pains suggested that whatever was going on was an intestinal issue. That covered a lot of possibilities, from food poisoning to something much more serious like appendicitis. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents if he'd eaten anything unusual lately. They looked at each other and listed various meals from the past few days, but then said that nothing out of the ordinary came to mind. Dr. Miller nodded, then asked Toby where it hurt most. With very shaky hands, Toby pointed to his stomach. Tears formed in his eyes, and he told Dr. Miller the pain was getting even worse. Dr. Miller smiled calmly, doing her best to hide her concern that Toby seemed to be sinking. The doctor grabbed a phone off the wall and called the lab to order blood and stool samples. That would likely identify what was happening inside of Toby's body. The doctor was pretty sure it was some kind of food poisoning, but the boy's intense discomfort suggested that it could be more serious than your run-of-the-mill 24-hour stomach bug. Dr. Miller took the parents aside and told them to make a list of every food and every place that Toby had eaten in the past 4 days. Dr. Miller promised they would find out what was happening to their son and they would do everything in their power to make him right again. A few hours later, Dr. Miller's phone rang. It was the lab with Toby's results. They found blood in Toby's stool, which indicated intestinal bleeding, most likely from bacteria in his food. So Dr. Miller had apparently been right. It was some kind of food poisoning. Now they needed to figure out what kind of food poisoning it was. The lab technician said they had already isolated the bacteria from Toby's stool for closer analysis. Dr. Miller thanked the technician and hung up. The good news was that they were now closer to knowing what was making Toby sick. But the bad news was, until then, Dr. Miller could not really aggressively treat Toby's illness. For many bacterial infections, the best treatment is antibiotics, but with certain strains of bacteria, such as highly toxic strains of E. coli, antibiotics can actually make the patient sicker or even kill them. So for now, all Dr. Miller could do was keep Toby's fever down with medication and his dehydration at bay with an IV drip. Dr. Miller checked in with Toby's parents and told them to get some rest and that she would be back at the hospital first thing in the morning. Then the doctor left the room and went to the night nurse and told her to please contact her at home if anything changed with Toby. The next morning, Dr. Miller had just sat down behind her desk with a mug of coffee when a nurse knocked on the door and poked her head in. She said there was a new arrival to the ER, a 4-year-old girl named Peyton Egger. She had a sweltering 104-degree fever, and her mother said she'd been vomiting on and off for 12 hours with repeated bouts of diarrhea. Dr. Miller's mind raced as she followed the nurse down to the emergency department. White curtains were drawn all around a gurney that had just been wheeled in. Little Peyton was lying on the gurney, drenched in sweat. Her face was drained of color, and she was struggling to keep her eyes open, and her parents stood to the side, clutching each other nervously. Dr. Miller immediately ordered the nurses to hook Peyton up to an IV drip while she checked the girl's vitals. Peyton's pulse was weak, and her blood pressure was dropping. Dr. Miller worried she might be going into shock, which could cause her organs to shut down. Dr. Miller realized that Peyton's symptoms were very similar to Toby's, so much so that she wondered if both kids had caught the same infection. Peyton's parents told Dr. Miller that their home was in a suburb north of Minneapolis, which was nowhere near where Toby's family lived. Still, Dr. Miller thought there must be something these two kids had in common. Dr. Miller called the lab and told them she wanted full blood work run on Peyton, plus stool samples tested as well. Then, Dr. Miller took Peyton's parents into the hallway and asked them for more details. The mother said that Peyton had been complaining of stomach pains last night, but it really hadn't seemed that serious. But at around midnight, Peyton woke up crying from all the pain and then began vomiting. After that, she kept vomiting nearly every hour and had several episodes of severe diarrhea. Then her temperature started spiking. By dawn, the parents said it was clear that whatever this was, it was only getting worse. So her parents had rushed her to the hospital. Dr. Miller said they had done the right thing. Peyton would be safe here. For now, the best thing they could do was just stay calm and wait. But that was advice Dr. Miller found easier to give than to practice. As Dr. Miller stepped out of Peyton's room and headed back to her office, a nurse hurried up to her and said the lab had been trying to reach her. Toby's new results were in. The boy was infected with a bacteria called Shigella. Finally, Dr. Miller knew what she was up against. Shigella attacks the digestive system, causing inflammation and bleeding within 12 to 48 hours after eating food contaminated with the bacteria. Toby had all of the classic symptoms: fever, abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea. Dr. Miller knew that if untreated, Shigella could send Toby into shock, which often leads to organ failure and occasionally even death. But at the same time, Dr. Miller was relieved. Although Shigella was obviously serious, it could be defeated with antibiotics, so she could finally start treating Toby. Dr. Miller told the attending nurse to prepare antibiotics for Toby and begin administering them as soon as they were ready. Then Dr. Miller rushed to Toby's room to give his parents the news. The boy was lying in his hospital bed with his eyes half open. His mother sat in a chair next to the bed, holding her son's hand and looking flushed and exhausted. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents to step outside with her so she could explain what was going on. But when Toby's mother tried to stand up, she wobbled and had to sit back down. She admitted she had not been feeling well since she woke up that morning. She said she even vomited a couple of times. Dr. Miller told Toby's mother to stay seated while she called for a nurse to prepare a bed for her. The doctor told her it was entirely possible that she was also now infected with Shigella, which was the bacteria that they had just discovered her son was infected with. After all, Shigella is so contagious that it can be passed in a handshake if someone who touched the bacteria didn't wash their hands well enough. As soon as Dr. Miller had settled Toby's mother into her own hospital bed, a receptionist waved the doctor down. It was the lab calling again. They had the results for Dr. Miller's other young patient, Peyton. She had Shigella too. Dr. Miller put down the phone. First Toby, then maybe Toby's mother, and now Peyton? Suddenly, Dr. Miller felt like she had an outbreak on her hands. And given how easily Shigella is transmitted, there were likely dozens more people out there suffering symptoms at home, and every one of those cases could make more people sick. Suddenly, Dr. Miller had a lot of calls to make. Later on that same afternoon in August of 1998, a young epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health named Dr. Julie Wickland was sitting at her desk when her secretary buzzed. She told her there was an urgent call coming in from a local hospital. Dr. Wickland was only in her 20s and still trying to prove herself professionally, but one thing she had already learned was that being an epidemiologist meant everything was a potential emergency. People's lives were always on the line. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Miller, who described the potential Shigella outbreak she was facing, 3 cases in her hospital, and likely a lot more people at home right now who just weren't sick enough to head to the hospital yet. But soon they would be. Once Dr. Wickland was done hearing from Dr. Miller, she requested to have Toby and Peyton's families fill out food history charts with everything they had eaten in the past 4 days. Then she met with her team at the Department of Health and assigned some of her best investigators to join her on this case. By the time she got back to her office, Dr. Wickland's secretary came in holding a stack of papers. The families had already filled out and faxed over their kids' food histories. Dr. Wickland spread them out on her desk and scanned them to look for commonalities. Right away, she noticed a pattern. They had all eaten at a restaurant called Roberta's. The odds were extremely low that both Toby and Peyton's families had eaten at the same place in the same 4-day window, especially considering how far apart they lived, and so this was exactly the type of breakthrough Dr. Wickland was hoping for. An hour later, Dr. Wickland and 2 other health officials stepped out of a dark sedan in front of the restaurant Roberta's, a modest neighborhood eatery. The manager was waiting for them by the entrance, looking very tense. The restaurant was temporarily closed for the rest of the day so that Dr. Wickland and her team could go and conduct their investigation there. Dr. Wickland needed to inspect every aspect of the restaurant's food handling for possible sources of contamination, such as spoiled food or dirty water. Dr. Wickland assigned one investigator to record the temperatures inside the refrigerators and freezers, while another investigator took water samples from all the sinks and taps. Then Dr. Wickland studied every step in the food's journey to the table, from the delivery area to the storage room to the food prep stations. The overall layout at Roberta's met safety standards, but Dr. Wickland knew how elusive Shigella could be. Shigella can show up almost anywhere and then can be spread by the people who are simply preparing the food. Dr. Wickland told the manager she needed to interview the entire staff. And so once the staff was gathered in the dining room, Dr. Wickland circled the room, asking each employee questions about their recent health and also their daily kitchen routine. Several members of the staff admitted to Dr. Wickland that they had not been feeling very good lately. Some had even been feverish and suffering pretty severe abdominal pains. It sounded worryingly similar to what Toby and Toby's mother and Peyton were all experiencing. Dr. Wickland then made copies of the restaurant's reservation list and credit card receipts from the past 4 days. Flipping through the pages, she estimated at least 400 people had eaten at Roberta's within a few days of when Dr. Miller's patients had eaten there. All of these diners were now at risk of getting Shigella. Back at the office, Dr. Wickland wrote up a questionnaire for all of Roberta's 400-plus diners. She needed to determine how many other customers out there were suffering similar symptoms. If any of them had contracted Shigella but didn't realize it, they could be infecting other people. These people needed to be notified right away, or else this situation could get much worse. The next morning, when Dr. Wickland arrived at her office, she learned that one of Roberta's employees had tested positive for Shigella. This confirmed that everyone who had eaten at the restaurant could now potentially be infected with the Shigella bacteria. But at least she now had a pretty good idea where the Shigella was coming from, a sick food prep worker who likely had not washed their hands properly. Dr. Wickland's first step was to call Roberta's and order the restaurant temporarily closed until the Shigella outbreak was totally contained. Then Dr. Wickland called Dr. Miller to get an update on her patients. Dr. Miller told her that Toby's mom was doing fine, but Toby and Peyton were struggling. Shigella is always harshest on the young and the elderly, and the children's conditions were not getting better. If they didn't start getting better soon, Dr. Miller feared they could go into shock and die. Early the next day, Dr. Wickland's phone rang with new results from the lab. Several more employees at Roberta's restaurant had tested positive for Shigella. This meant that the disease outbreak was not coming from a single unsanitary worker. It was coming from lots of places. Dr. Wickland got a fresh cup of coffee and then sat down at her desk to begin studying the first wave of questionnaire results from Roberta's recent customers. And she was disturbed to see that a full half of the 400 diners reported experiencing symptoms that were consistent with Shigella. But as Dr. Wickland studied the responses, something about the data just didn't seem right. A large percentage of infected diners had eaten at Roberta's before any of the employees started to get sick. So it was unlikely that the employees were giving the infection to the customers. The workers were actually victims too. Dr. Wickland leaned back in her chair and took a deep, defeated breath. She now realized that she actually had no idea where all the Shigella cases were coming from. An hour later, the manager at Roberta's unlocked the restaurant door and let in Dr. Wickland. She told the team to put on gloves and start discarding every piece of food in the building. Nothing could be saved. Roberta's manager was happy to comply, and Dr. Wickland told him the business could reopen once all the food had been thrown away and the entire restaurant professionally cleaned. They couldn't afford to take any chances. Dr. Wickland pulled a bin of produce off a shelf and dumped it in the trash. The Shigella was somewhere under this roof, and Dr. Wickland was not going to let it slip past her. Dr. Wickland returned to her office at the Department of Health to find a report sitting on her desk. Her heart sank. It was the details of another case of Shigella, this time north of Minneapolis. A 33-year-old woman had been rushed to a hospital after hours of vomiting, fever, and diarrhea. The night before, the woman had eaten at an upscale restaurant in her neighborhood called Marty's. Not only that, but she'd gone to the restaurant with multiple friends, all of whom had been contacted and reported feeling sick. But Marty's restaurant was very far from Roberta's. For this illness to strike two restaurants in entirely different areas, miles apart from one another, was extremely rare. Dr. Wickland sighed and called the manager at Marty's to tell them the restaurant would have to close until further notice. She said that a health official would be there shortly to collect their reservation list and credit card receipts, and all their recent diners would need to be contacted about the disease outbreak. Dr. Wickland then called a meeting with her investigators to brainstorm. She felt lucky that there had been no fatalities so far, but she also knew that young children were in the greatest danger. She told her team they had to find the link between Marty's restaurant and Roberta's restaurant that could explain all the Shigella cases. Maybe both restaurants sourced particular food items from the same place, or maybe an employee worked part-time at both restaurants, or maybe they shared a water supplier. Whatever it was, she told her team they had to go find out. By the next afternoon, Dr. Wickland had more information to go on. She and her team had worked around the clock, contacting people and compiling timelines of symptoms. It was a lot to sift through, but she knew it was always better to have too much information rather than not enough. As Dr. Wickland made her way through all the paper piled on her desk, the differences between the two restaurants really jumped out at her. Marty's got its water from a different reservoir than Roberta's, so this was not a water issue. There was also almost zero overlap in their menus because Roberta's and Marty's served very different types of food. And a review of the two restaurants' employees showed that no staff members worked in both places either. The researchers could not even identify a single food that all the sick customers at each restaurant had eaten. Everyone ordered different dishes, yet got sick the same way. And so Dr. Wickland wondered to herself, how could that be? This just doesn't seem possible. Just then, the phone rang. It was the lab with an update on the Marty's restaurant customers. Everyone who tested had come back positive for Shigella. The lab had also done a genetic comparison of the Shigella bacteria from the Marty's diners and the Roberta's diners, and they found them to be identical. Clearly, both restaurants had been contaminated by the same source. Dr. Wickland thanked the technician and hung up. She felt stumped, exhausted, and ready to call it quits for the day, but she did have a couple more calls to make. The first one just to check up on Toby and Peyton. On the other end of the line, Dr. Miller sounded equally exhausted. She said Toby was still bedridden because his body was not responding to the antibiotics. He was now faced with a painful and slow recovery. Little Peyton Egger was even worse. Dr. Miller had nurses monitoring her around the clock, but her family was obviously worried sick. Dr. Wickland thanked her for the update, then she hung up and scrolled through her Rolodex until she found the United States Centers for Disease Control. This outbreak was clearly not settling down the way Dr. Wickland hoped it would, and so it was time to call in reinforcements. Dr. Timothy Niemi was in his office packing up to head home when his phone rang. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but his position as an epidemic intelligence officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had taught him the danger of missing an emergency call. So he picked up the phone and he listened carefully as Dr. Wickland explained the events of the past week and how the Shigella outbreak showed no signs of slowing down. Dr. Wickland said she needed the CDC's help in finding the outbreak's origin so they could stop it. Every bacterial outbreak has its own genetic fingerprint that makes it unique, and the CDC keeps a massive database of these fingerprints from all over the world. Dr. Niemi told Dr. Wickland to email him an image of the Shigella bacteria's DNA profile. Then he could use the CDC's database to see if the same Shigella strain had been reported anywhere else. The moment Dr. Niemi uploaded the Shigella bacteria from Minnesota to his database, Shigella outbreaks in other areas popped up all over. From Los Angeles County to Boston to Florida, plus up in Canada, in Alberta and Ontario. Each outbreak had been linked to a specific restaurant, and all were genetically identical. This meant that there was a good chance all of these Shigella outbreaks were caused by the same source of contamination. The sheer breadth of locations baffled Dr. Niemi. He stared at the map. How did the same contaminant spread across both coasts, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and all the way up into Canada? He emailed his coworkers the results and asked them to help him contact every restaurant associated with an outbreak and compile a comprehensive list of foods and ingredients on their menus. There had to be something in common to all of them that was carrying this particular strain of Shigella. The next morning, one of Dr. Niemi's fellow investigators strolled into his office and handed him a Post-it note with one word written on it. Dr. Niemi read the note and couldn't help but laugh. The investigators had identified the probable source of the Shigella outbreak, and it was something that no one suspected. Dr. Niemi's department even had a term for this particular ingredient. They called it stealth food, because it's used in a wide variety of dishes, yet usually goes unnoticed. Dr. Niemi congratulated his team. This was the best lead they had. He picked up a phone and he called a colleague at the Food and Drug Administration named Jeremy Brown. Dr. Niemi told Jeremy what they had discovered and said he'd need the FDA's help tracing this particular ingredient, the stealth food, to the original supplier. Global supply chains for restaurants are incredibly complex, with foods shipping from across the world and constantly being reprocessed and repackaged, and so finding one bad batch of food among all of that would not be easy. Jeremy said he would get to work. A few days later, Jeremy rode in a Jeep through Ensenada, Mexico. At first, the countryside was dry and dusty, but as they curved over a hillside, suddenly everything turned green. For miles into the distance, Jeremy saw nothing but crops in organized rows. Finally, they turned onto a dirt road and passed a sign that said the name of the farm, Valle Verde. The farmhand pointed out different fields of produce, including tomatoes, celery, cilantro, green onions, radishes, and lettuces, all watered by massive irrigation machines. But the biggest spread of all was an entire 55-acre parcel devoted to growing nothing but the stealth food Jeremy had come to investigate. And the stealth food was parsley. At some point between when it was harvested and when it was shipped, this parsley was becoming contaminated with Shigella bacteria. Jeremy was not going to leave the farm until he found out where and how this was happening. The Jeep came to a stop on the banks of an old riverbed. Since tainted water is the most common cause of Shigella, Jeremy had requested to visit the farm's water supply first. The farmhand hopped out and led them to a series of wells that provided all of the farm's water. Jeremy looked inside one of them. The stone casing was old, but uncracked. The shaft was dug very deep, so that the water came from far underground, which meant the likelihood of contamination was actually quite small. Jeremy could tell the issue was not the wells. Next, the farmhand drove them past several meadows to a reservoir that served as the farm's backup water supply. It looked like a small fresh lake. The water seemed clean, but Jeremy still bottled up a couple of samples for testing back in the US. The farmhand asked Jeremy where he wanted to head next. Jeremy said he could use a break from the heat. It had gotten much hotter as the afternoon wore on. A few minutes later, the Jeep rumbled to a stop in front of a huge farm shed with a corrugated steel roof. It contained long conveyor belts stacked with crates of parsley. At the end of the line, men took those crates and stacked them on a pallet and then hosed them down with chilled water from a machine called a hydro cooler. Jeremy watched as hundreds of boxes quickly piled up and were loaded into the backs of huge trucks and then driven away to be shipped all across North America. Jeremy asked the farmhand if the water for the hydro cooler came from their wells or the reservoir, but the farmhand shook his head and said neither. The water for the hydro cooler came from Ensenada's municipal water supply. Jeremy put on his sunglasses and told the farmhand that that was where he needed to go next. At the municipal water plant, the facilities director admitted that they had been a bit overwhelmed lately. Due to government funding cutbacks, they had been understaffed for a while. With fewer security guards to watch the place, there had been a few break-ins lately, and some equipment had even been damaged. At one of the water filtration systems, Jeremy noticed that the machine that normally disinfects the water with chlorine was shut down. Jeremy asked the manager if the chlorinator had just been turned off today or if it really was not working at all. The manager shook his head in frustration and said this had been on their list to get fixed for over a month, but the city hadn't managed to send over the parts yet. Jeremy did his best to hide his shock. Without chlorine, all sorts of contaminants could flourish in the water, including Shigella. From there, the water was pumped to businesses, homes, and farms all over the area, like the parsley crop at Valle Verde. Jeremy filled several bottles to be tested and told the farmhand it was time to go. Days later, Jeremy got his results. Ensenada's municipal water was loaded with Shigella. And it was the same strain as the one found at Roberta's, Marty's, and all the other restaurants. The contaminated water had been sprayed directly onto the parsley right before being shipped to restaurants all across North America, where people like Toby, Peyton, and their families ate the parsley without giving it a second thought. Jeremy knew they had been lucky in tracking down the source relatively quickly. He estimated that as many as 1,000 diners had caught Shigella from one harvest of contaminated parsley, but it could have been so much worse. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, and both Toby and Peyton eventually made full recoveries. But very few of those who got sick will ever look at their parsley garnish the same way again. Late one evening in 1840, a 30-year-old British nobleman named Sir Robert Warboys stood next to 5 of his closest friends on the front porch of a townhome in one of the fanciest neighborhoods in London, England. The address of this townhome was 50 Berkeley Square, and it was one of dozens of these beautiful brick and marble townhomes that surrounded this big garden. The whole square had been built about 100 years earlier, and since then it had become one of the most fashionable places for the rich and famous to call home. However, Robert and his friends had not come here to rub shoulders with important people. Instead, Robert had come here to win a bet. So Robert actually was a nobleman. He was like this proper guy, at least on paper. But in reality, at least to his friends, he had a total wild streak. He loved taking on dares. Basically, anytime anybody, challenged him to do something, he would do it, especially if there was money on the line. But it wasn't really about the money. It wasn't about, winning money by doing these different things. He just loved the challenge. He loved the thrill of taking chances. So that night, on the front porch of this townhome, Robert turned and knocked on the front door. And then as soon as he did, he turned back and looked at his friends and grinned at them. And he saw some of them looked really excited and some looked pretty nervous. But to Robert, he was purely happy about how things were going so far. Because he knew, come tomorrow when this whole thing was done and he had won his bet, he would have a great story to tell. A few seconds later, the front door of the townhome swung open and this middle-aged man stepped outside. His name was Charles Benson, and while Robert and Charles did know each other, they were not close friends. They actually only knew each other because they both were members of the same exclusive gentlemen's club in London. Plus, pretty much everybody in London had at least heard of Charles because of all the rumors swirling around about what went on inside of his townhome. Even though Robert had told Charles that on this night he and his buddies were coming to his townhome for this bet, even though he had clearly told him, Charles still seemed very surprised to see Robert standing there. But Robert nonetheless was like, "Hey Charles, how are you? I'm here for the bet." And Charles basically didn't react. He just stared at Robert with this very concerned look on his face and just said, "Are you sure you really want to do this?" And Robert, who knew what he was referencing, just kind of looked down at the pistol on his hip and said, "Yeah, I'm sure." A few minutes later, Robert and his 5 friends were inside of Charles' townhome in the dining room, sitting around a table, while Charles had gone upstairs to get something. And as they sat there, Robert kind of looked around the room at his friends, and he could tell they were clearly more nervous about this than he was. And so he tried to, keep the mood light by making some jokes and kind of downplaying what he was about to do. But it was like no matter what he did, he could just tell his friends were very uneasy about what was going to happen here. And then a moment later, they heard the sound of Charles coming down the stairs. And Charles, he came in the kitchen, still with a very serious look on his face. And he walked up to them and he reached in his pocket and he pulled out this old iron key and he placed it in the middle of the table. And as soon as he did that, the room went completely silent and everybody just stared at this key. And then Charles eventually broke the silence and explained to the group that over the last 10 years of living in this townhome, he had only used that key maybe 2 or 3 times total. And when the key was not in use, Charles said he actually hid the key just to make sure it never wound up in the wrong hands. But now, again with that somber look on his face, Charles looked over at Robert and said, "If you're really sure about this, the key is yours to take." And Robert, with no hesitation, reached out and snatched the key, showing his friends and showing Charles that he was not about to get cold feet. A couple of minutes later, all the men stood up from the dining room table, and then Charles led the group up the thin, narrow, creaky staircase to the second floor. And when they got to the second floor, Charles led them down this narrow hallway that came to a stop in front of this closed door. At this point, all 7 men were kind of crowded together right in front of this door. But it was obvious that even though Charles lived in this townhome, he was sort of hesitant to get even close to this door. Like he really didn't want to be anywhere near it. Also, all of Robert's friends were sort of reacting the same way too. I mean, they were the ones that actually dared Robert to do this in the first place. But now that they were actually here, about to go through with it, they were looking at Robert like he was totally insane. And also they were kind of hoping that, maybe he would just back out and they could just leave. But Robert did not seem remotely like he was about to back out. He had a very determined look on his face. And as everybody else was kind of cowering away from this door, Robert stepped up, reached into his pocket, pulled out that iron key, and put it into the lock. And as he began to turn the lock, everybody else took steps farther away from him. And then he pulled open the door, and as he did, everybody gasped, and Robert even took a step backwards. But when Robert actually looked through the now open doorway, he just laughed, because it was just a normal bedroom. It was filled with all this old but very expensive looking furniture. On one side of the room was this big wooden dresser with a huge round mirror above it, and then on the opposite side of the room was this big 4-poster bed. And right above this bed, dangling down from the ceiling, was this red ribbon. Now, Robert knew that in a rich nobleman's house, there were ribbons like this one that are known as bell pulls. A nobleman could pull on that lever, and it was connected to a pulley system that rang a bell down in the servants' quarters. And when the servant heard that bell, they would see what room it was coming from, and they would go up to the room to see what the nobleman needed. And so after taking in the sight of this bedroom, Robert took a confident step into the room. And as soon as he did, Charles reached out and grabbed him by the wrist and said, "Hey, Robert, this is your last chance to change your mind. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" And Robert kind of looked back at his friends and smiled and said, "I'm sure. I'll see you guys tomorrow morning once I've won the bet." Then Robert released Charles's grip on his wrist, walked into the room, turned, shut, and locked the door. At this moment, Robert's friends didn't really know what to do. They were still sort of shocked that Robert was actually going through with this. I mean, even by his standards, this felt particularly reckless. They also felt kind of guilty. I mean, they were the ones who ultimately put him up to this. So, if Robert got hurt, which in theory could actually happen here, it would be partially their fault. And so Robert's friends turned to Charles to see what he was thinking. And Charles had this very grave, resigned expression on his face. And he just told them, "I have one more thing to show you before we go to bed." So Robert's friends followed Charles back down the hallway, down the stairs, past the dining room, towards the very back of the townhome. And when they got there, they found there was sort of like a studio apartment area back there. There was a kitchen area, a laundry area, and there were several beds. Charles explained this was where his servants lived and worked, but he had given them all the night off because he knew it was possible that Robert and his friends would be here for this bet and they would need a place to stay. Charles pointed to a space right above the beds where there was this row of all these bells in a horizontal line. Each of these bells were connected to various bell pulls throughout the house. And he pointed to one particular bell and told them that that was the one that was connected to the bell pull in the room Robert was staying in tonight. And so he said it was their job tonight to constantly monitor that bell all night. So somebody had to be awake all night listening to that bell. Because heaven forbid, if Robert pulls that bell, that was going to be the signal that something bad had happened in that room. And so their job was basically to be on guard all night to potentially run up and rescue Robert if he needed it. Around 3 hours later, all of Robert's friends were sitting on the floor in the servants' quarters playing blackjack. It was almost midnight, and all of them were exhausted, but they were too on edge to sleep. They were so focused on this bell, and they were so worried about Robert and, wondering if he was really okay up there. And they also had become convinced that, maybe the bell would ring and they wouldn't hear it if they were making too much noise. And so they had made this decision to silently play blackjack and just focus exclusively on this bell. But it had really created a lot of extra tension in the room. They're basically all just staring at the bell, dealing one hand after another, paranoid it would go off, and wondering what would even happen if it did. And so hand after hand, the friends are playing blackjack, anxiously watching this bell being completely silent. And then suddenly they hear this sound that makes them all jump. But it wasn't the bell. It was a blood-curdling scream coming from upstairs. And for a moment, the friends just sat there in shock. And then they got up and began running out of the servants' quarters to see what was going on. And as they did, Robert's bell began ringing furiously, so loud it hurt their ears. And so they charge out of the servants' quarters and literally bump into Charles, who also is coming to figure out what's going on. And as a group, they begin running up the stairs to the second floor. And all the while, the bell is ringing furiously. There's screams coming from Robert's bedroom. And by the time they got to the second floor, suddenly everything went silent. The ringing stopped, the screaming stopped. They're in the second floor in that hallway, and it's just deadly silent. And up ahead of them is that closed door. And so Charles and the group, they begin walking down the hall, having no idea what to expect. And right as they're about to reach the door, they hear this loud bang sound. And then silence again. Seconds later, Robert's friends were at that door, pounding on it, screaming for Robert, "Come open the door," because Robert was the only one with the key. But Robert wasn't making any noise. The room was still totally silent. And so eventually the friends began kicking on this door to try to break it down. All the while, Charles is just kind of standing back in the hallway, watching this horrible thing unfold. And then finally, the friends manage to literally kick the door in. I mean, it's a 100-year-old house. The door gets kicked in, and the friends stumble into the room, and they look over towards the bedroom, and they all just freeze in shock. When Charles bought this townhome 10 years earlier, it came with a very dark backstory. The previous owner had apparently kept his violent and psychotic brother locked up inside of this second floor bedroom where Robert was. And after this brother died inside of this room, all these strange and frightening things began happening inside of this room. People began hearing these awful wailing sounds coming out of this room when nobody was in there. And then they'd go into the room and the wailing would stop, but furniture had been moved all around the room, even though, again, no one had been in there to do that. And then also, people began seeing this sort of amorphous gray figure sort of moving around inside of that room, especially at night, kind of slinking up against the wall and across the floor. And even though nobody had any idea what it was, it just felt like it was evil. And so they began calling it the nameless thing, and they referred to it as the physical manifestation of evil. However, not everybody believed this story. In fact, one person who absolutely did not believe the story was Robert Warboys. He thought this was just a tall tale designed to scare people. And so when his friends dared him to spend one night inside of that bedroom where supposedly the nameless thing lived, he happily accepted, because to him, it didn't seem risky at all. Spending one night in the haunted room was no big deal because it's not actually haunted. He'd be fine. And anyways, it would make for a great story to tell down at the Gentleman's Club. Unfortunately, though, the night in that bedroom did not go as Robert hoped. When Robert's friends burst through the bedroom door and looked inside, the first thing they noticed was the bell pull, the ribbon from the ceiling, had been yanked out of the ceiling, and Robert's pistol was on the ground next to the bed. And then on the other side of the room, there was a very obvious bullet hole in the wall. And so that was the loud bang sound they heard as they were coming down the hall. It was the pistol going off. And then there was Robert. Robert was laying on the bed, and he was totally rigid, and he actually was still clutching the red ribbon from the bell pull. And as they stared at him, they saw his eyes were wide open and bloodshot, and his lips were kind of pulled back in this horrible grimace with his teeth exposed. And for a second, his friends thought Robert must be having a seizure of some kind. That's why he was so tight on the bed like that. And so they ran to him, trying to snap him out of it. But as soon as they touched him, they realized that the reason he was rigid was not because of a seizure. It was because Robert was dead. That night, Charles would call the local coroner, who would come by and take Robert's body, and also he would open up an official inquest into Robert's death to figure out what had happened to him. And the verdict of this inquest was that Robert had died from massive heart failure caused by unknown circumstances. But to Charles and all of Robert's friends who were there that night and actually saw Robert in the room, it seemed plainly obvious that what had happened here was Robert had come in contact with the so-called nameless thing in that room, and it literally scared him to death. In the nearly 200 years since Robert's death, 50 Berkeley Square has had many different owners, and virtually all of them have reported either seeing, feeling, or hearing some sort of malevolent, ghostly presence inside of that second floor bedroom. To this day, that particular bedroom, where the nameless thing apparently resides, is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen's Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies